Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Carolyn McVean. I'm the Parliamentary Librarian. First, on behalf of the Parliament of Victoria and its members, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past and present, and we also pay respect to people from First Nation communities who may be joining us. I welcome you to our seminar. It's about regenerative approaches for Victoria's nature from bush to the city. We're pleased to present this event jointly with ATSE, the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. Excuse me. Our moderator today is Professor Paul Wood, AO. He's an adjunct professor at Monash University, and he previously led R&D teams at the CSIRO, the CSL and Pfizer. He currently chairs the board of Viridian Renewable Technology and is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for the Global Methane Hub. Paul is also on the board of ATSE. We'll have the presentations and then we'll get to the questions, and there will be some roving microphones around with people attached to them. So if you've got any questions, leave them till later and we'll get your questions there. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Caroline, and it's great to be here for the first of these for the year. And as a board member of the Academy, I'd just like to thank the library. I understand this association is going for 15 years now, so it's great to be here and have the opportunity to discuss really important topics. So today, obviously, regenerative approaches for Victoria's nature from the bush to the city. So we've got two excellent speakers who I'll give a bit of a bio in a minute. But obviously diversity is a really important thing. It's not only one of those things about the beauty of Victoria that's important sort of to individuals. It gives them a sense of place. It's a great way to engage with our local Indigenous communities. And also what we're going to hear today is from city to the bush. So if we think about sometimes biodiversity, people only think about the bush. So we're going to try to contrast that today. And we've got one speaker covering dominantly the city and one covering the bush. It's also about Victoria's climate reliance. I think everyone knows what the challenge is, but the issue is we have to be more resilient. So this is really about that as well. And as I said, it's also a great way for us to engage with our Indigenous communities. So let me introduce our two speakers. So Professor Sarah Bekessy, Icon Science Group, she leads at the University of Melbourne. Also looking at biodiversity and urban design. So the whole concept that, if you build it into your design, it's a lot easier to have something that's compatible with biodiversity other than trying to retrofit things. She's also an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. Tegan Hibberson, she's a dedicated conservation professional with Bush Heritage. She's the Victorian Health Landscape Manager for the Bush Heritage Australia, and also involved in collaborations with our First Nations. So with those few words, I think you've got their full bios. Then I'll invite Sarah to talk.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak to you today on this topic of regenerating nature. And I'll be talking about the city context in particular. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people, and pay my deepest respects to elders past and present. And of course this idea, as Paul mentioned, of regenerating nature in cities is a huge opportunity to celebrate Indigenous culture. And we can do this in many ways. We can do this through the choice of plants that we have in our gardens, in our streetscapes, in our parks. There are over 700 locally native species, plant species in Melbourne, many of which are deeply important culturally, have food values, fibre, medicine values. We can do it through the choice of animals that we seek to bring back into our city. There's a fabulous butterfly called the common brown butterfly, which is unfortunately named because it's not common and it's not actually brown, but it once used to emerge in huge numbers at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons. I personally think it'd be a wonderful story to bring back to Melbourne, that we're connecting culture and nature in the middle of our city. We can also do it through building opportunities for First Nations people in the implementation of urban nature, in the design of urban nature, and the governance of urban nature. But as well as providing that cultural connection and that really important sense of place, nature can also help us tackle some of the really unprecedented challenges that we are facing in cities. Extreme weather events, pandemics. We've got a mental wellbeing and loneliness crisis in cities, exponential population growth. These are all things that we're scrambling to find solutions for. And we know that through nature we can cool a city by about 8 degrees overnight in heat waves. We can try and minimise some of the more extreme events of storms and other climate change related events. And we can deliver a truly remarkable array of health and wellbeing benefits. If you're lucky enough to live in a street with more biodiversity, you'll sleep better at night. You'll have a lower probability of suffering from mental wellbeing issues. You'll actually have less likelihood of developing diabetes and cancer and heart disease. These are well-evidenced benefits of urban nature. If your child is lucky enough to play in a schoolyard with more biodiversity, they'll have improved cognitive development and lower rates of behavioural issues. I mean, just imagine the benefits to the Victorian economy if every Victorian had access to those kinds of opportunities. The economic benefits extend well beyond just our health and well-being. Having nature in retail strips actually increases foot traffic, well evidenced, so that people buy. There are more people, buying more stuff, which apparently is a good thing. CBD buildings with vegetation, with rooftop gardens, courtyards, vegetation on the sides of buildings, they have increased occupancy rates and more consistent occupancy rates. We also know that we can enable threatened species to thrive and survive in our cities, and we can re-enchant people with the very idea of nature again. So for all of these reasons, nature has become a central part of the discussion about the future of livable cities. But you can actually fill a city with trees and have little benefit for biodiversity. Think about the boulevard of plane trees, which we all love. It's essentially a biological desert. And that's a pity, because many of the benefits I've described are linked to biodiversity, not just green. But it's also a pity because cities have actually got a really important role to play in helping with the biodiversity extinction crisis. Cities are biodiversity hotspots. There are 3 times the number of threatened species per unit area in and around our cities as there are in their rural counterparts, including these 39 species that only occur in cities, like the Frankston spider orchid, and many others that sometimes increasingly are using cities for habitat because it's being degraded or destroyed elsewhere in their range. Australia, we need to also remember that Australia is one of the most important places in the world for biodiversity. We're a mega diverse nation, we're a wealthy nation, and most of our species are found nowhere else on the planet. And yet we know that we're also leading the world in terms of biodiversity extinction. There are now more than 2,200 species listed as being on the edge of extinction under our EPBC Act. Many of those common species, like gang cockatoos and bogong moths that once used to plaster the windows of Canberra Parliament House. I think we do need to increasingly see cities as a place for actually helping solve the biodiversity extinction crisis. Step 1, of course, is to protect what you have. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of cities around Australia growing into areas that have some of our most critically endangered ecosystems. In Melbourne, we have the Basalt Plains grassland. There's less than 1% of it left. It's riddled with threatened species, and yet it's where we continue to grow our housing. Yes, we know we need more homes. That's absolutely a no-brainer. But we also know that we can do it without sort of being at the expense of threatened species and ecosystems. And that's why at the Biodiversity Council, where I'm a lead councillor, we've established a nature pledge for developers and for investors to grow homes and also grow nature at the same time, rather than actually destroying threatened species habitat when we're developing homes. But being regenerative for nature is more than just protecting the golden bits that we have left. It's about working out how we build nature back into the urban fabric. And that's why we designed this idea called biodiversity sensitive urban design. It's a process, a scientifically driven process for thinking really carefully about how you allow plants and animals to thrive in the places where we all live, work and play. And so it's a process of thinking through what it is that you want to achieve. So, for example, you might want to have fairy wrens back in your neighbourhood. Wouldn't that be lovely? Once you've got your set of objectives, thinking about how you actually deliver the resources that they're going to need. For fairy wrens, we're going to need to have water sources. We're going to need to have mid-story, that shrub layer that we're often missing in our gardens, in our parks, in our streetscapes. We're going to need to think through the threats that might prevent them from being there. So they're going to be cars, for example. Can we have traffic calming measures? Cats, keeping cats indoors. There are good design solutions for all of these things. We need to think about connectivity. How are the fairy wrens going to get to your neighbourhood? So we need to think about the landscape of Melbourne, our major cities, and think about how animals move around them and can start to recolonise new parts of the city. But it's also about thinking really carefully about how we do this so that people have positive interactions with nature. Yes, it's about designing our cities to be beautiful and enchanting, but we might also need some signs to let people know what we're doing. We might need some programs like citizen science to help people, to engage people in this process of regeneration. So we're working with some innovative developers and government agencies and green building certifiers in Australia and globally to try and demonstrate that this is not only possible and feasible, but it's also completely desirable and it's enchanting. It's healthy for biodiversity and for people. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Tegan, who's going to take this conversation in a slightly different direction. Of course, it's really important to think about city boundaries and what we do for biodiversity within the city, but of course the impacts of cities go well beyond the city boundary, and a lot of rural Victoria is used to provide the resources that we all need in cities and to accept the waste. So it's super important to think really carefully about how we regenerate nature in rural Victoria as well. I'm going to hand over to Tegan, who represents one of my favourite organisations in the world, Bush Heritage Australia.
All right. Here we go. Thank you, Sarah. And so my name is Tegan Hibberson. I'm the Healthy Landscape Manager for Bush Heritage Australia. I would also like to pay my respects and recognise and acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country. I'd also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people in the room or watching this recording as well. Obviously, hopefully you're in the room because you're interested in biodiversity and regenerative solutions. We really need everyone to come to the table and value biodiversity as much as possible, and hopefully you learned something from Sarah's talk. I certainly did. But if you're not quite sure, the value of biodiversity is not just its intrinsic value. And for a lot of us, that's why we get into this sector. We are just innately, they have the right to be there. But also from an economic point of view, biodiversity is linked. It's about 20% of our annual GDP when you look at it in total, which is enormous. We need to think around landscape scale approaches, and that's what we do at Bush Heritage Australia. We're a national not-for-profit agency, and we purchase and manage in partnership land right across Australia. At the moment, we own about 46 conservation reserve, which accounts for about 1.46 million hectares, in partnerships with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders on generally land they own through IPAs. It's roughly around the 12 million hectares, and in agricultural partnerships, about 10 million hectares at the moment. We have a really bold vision. By 2030, we need to get up to about 30 million hectares of influence and impact to meet the scale to meet the challenge that we're facing at the moment. So nationally, we're pretty big. In Victoria, I manage around 3,000 hectares of conservation estate, primarily on Djadja country. And this is a bit of a case study I'd like to talk you through. We work in the Riverina Goldfields priority landscape. Bush heritage is really prescriptive and quite strategic in where we work. If we want to have impact, we have to be really smart about where we choose to put our limited resources. And we do that through looking nationally at underrepresented systems and systems that are most threat. For Victoria, we've got that across the Riverina Goldfields priority landscape. That covers about 5.4 million hectares. That's a big space with very small land parcels across the state. So we focus in even more. We rerun analysis, we look at climate data, we look at threatened species data, we bring all of it in to make sure we are as impactful as possible. And the key area for us is the Karakara Wedderburn focal landscape. This is Warwick Gulkanu. It's a shared strategic landscape plan. I do have a few up the back and it's going to be in the catalogue, but it's a 20-year partnership with Jarrah, and it's a new way of really showing how you can do joint land management, leading from Jarrah's purpose and sorry, I forgot my words here, their focus and just their aspirations for their country. How do we support their aspirations for country with Western science? So really making sure it's a very integrative approach and it is built on trust and respect. And that's one of the things when working with First Nations that is incredible working with Bush Heritage is we take the time. We have these properties in perpetuity and we, as you can see from the timeline down the bottom, it's a 20-year relationship to get to a point where stories are shared, knowledge is shared, and we can have that joint aspiration for country and start to actually put actions in place on the ground in the right way, having the right people, the right conversations, the right tools, cultural fire, with the right people. And the benefits we get from that ecologically are just tenfold than what we're doing when we're working in silos with each other. I've lost my time. Sorry. Working in this landscape, we work with Jarrah, but we also work with a range of other neighbours and communities. We don't work in isolations. It's really important to make sure that we are working as a connected landscape and we really focus that across Australia. I make sure that we really work to make sure we're increasing our impact. So not just working on our reserves, but how do I bring our neighbours in to teach them about rehydration trials? How do I bring them in to show them the increases and the benefits we're doing with trials through wheel cactus so that we can collaboratively pool resources and make sure we're having the most biodiverse outcomes that we possibly can. Through this, we're learning better ways of propagating orchids, which we have 5 critically endangered orchids just within our landscape alone, and likely more. We have malleefowl, Lawan, which is a critical ecological engineer, which has almost been lost, and this is their most southern extent. When you think about that through a lens of climate change as well, making sure you have those really strong refugias through the landscapes and they have that ability to move across is critical. And in Victoria, I suppose I really just want to reiterate that we need to protect and restore everything we possibly can. We know that the biodiversity is declining right across the country and the state. Even with current investments, it's not nearly enough. We really need to focus on how do we increase it at the scale that's needed to not only meet our own internal targets, 2030 targets for one of them, but how do we actually make sure that the next generation can witness and be included in protecting biodiversity and have the values that we've all been lucky enough to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Tegan. So what you've heard, if I sum up, is that biodiversity is not just a nice to have. It's actually critical to our health, our well-being, and the livability of our cities. So that's if I took the top message that I took, hopefully you also picked up a lot of information. So now we've got plenty of time for questions. So if I ask you both to join me at the front here, and we'll open up to questions. So anyone want to start us off? Yes, thank you.
G'day, thanks for that. My name's Ash, I work for David Limbrick, but prior to working here for 15 years, my job was conservation and land management. So I've worked from the Upper Yarra River, weed mapping, getting rid of willows, right out to Whittlesea. So a lot of you mentioned the Western Plains grasslands, a lot of the sites that you see in the various grasslands books, they're sites that I've worked on. I was very excited when the government first announced the Western Plains Grassland Reserve, a very large grassland reserve that was meant to be awesome. And then I spent about 10 years working on it, spraying hundreds of thousands of litres of herbicide on the same serrated tussock. Meanwhile, other sites such as Stanley Park in Macedon probably only got preserved because of the efforts of a local resident named Helen, and that's one of the most biodiverse little patches I've ever worked on in my life. So my question is, how do you kind of get a better prioritisation of those really biodiverse sites to make sure that they don't get left behind for some kind of big shiny project like the Western Plains Grasslands, which to me just looks like a massive investment of money for a pretty degraded environmental asset?
I think it's probably for both our speakers, so.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think this is a challenge, across all of the Australian cities. I think Melbourne's not alone having some critically endangered ecosystems right on our doorsteps. But I think, really it is about two things. It's about doing everything you can to protect what you've got. As you point out, it's really hard to bring values back once they're gone. And, if a site is degraded, especially grasslands, it's incredibly hard to bring it back to good health. And I think, Bush Heritage could tell you just how much it costs to do that. It's really expensive, but it's obviously, an incredibly important investment because we gain so much from having healthy ecosystems. But, we can't just invest in reserves that are out of sight, out of mind. We also have to bring, I think, to bring the public along with this journey and to deliver the benefits to people that I described in their everyday lives. We need to bring nature, really into the urban fabric as well. And when people appreciate that you can have a little patch of basalt plains grassland, I've got a little patch of basalt plains grassland in, a 3 metre squared patch underneath the plane tree outside my front door. And that's not, it's not a sort of grassland reserve, but it's actually showing the community how beautiful this ecosystem is. And it's providing, hopefully, a stepping stone for species. It's about protecting what we have and then really regenerating nature in the urban fabric to bring people along board, to create cities that aren't hostile for nature, that are actually providing resources and are going to be really important for their future survival.
And I can add probably around the spatial prioritisation side of it is actually really looking at, we have great data. When you compare Victoria's data sets to some of the other states, we actually have really good data on some of this. So pulling that data in and then using it. So we created Warwick Gold Canoe. We look at a lot of kind of national requirements, then we look at state requirements, and then we brought in CSIRO data to look at kind of climate refugia and a whole lot of other hosts of information in there. And then we put it out and we really make sure that those priorities, that people know these are the priorities that we're working with, this is the focus, and then branching that into other strategic landscapes. So I work with North Central CMA, there's a few other agencies as well, just to make sure you're all starting to run on the same playbook And if there are significant competing priorities, working that through so that way all that work doesn't get lost. You're putting the efforts and the resources in the right spot where you can gain momentum as opposed to working in competition.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. You were mentioning just now, how do we, can we make cities to be less hostile to nature? And I was wondering, do you know if there's anything going on in the city planning space to address light and noise pollution from cities, given that that is one of the factors leading to population decline of a lot of species?
I know that there are lots of local councils that are really trying to tackle this really effectively. So, for example, in Phillip Island, where we had the fairy penguins, light pollution was a really super problematic, because the poor little penguins were, sort of assuming that the street lighting was the moon, I suppose, and sort of getting lost. And so that is a really sort of tangible reason for the Phillip Island Council to be thinking about how they can have wildlife-sensitive lighting. And so they've implemented wildlife-sensitive lighting in key places around Phillip Island. I know that. I think this is something that we have been trying to estimate what it would cost for across the board for us to shift to wildlife sensitive lighting across the board, and it's actually not as expensive as we think. So I think the solutions are not necessarily going to be blowing budgets out. So it's really. I think it's ripe for the pickings in terms of new policies and new directions that try and sort of really motivate these kinds of pilot studies and pilot success stories to be much more mainstream.
Hi, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I note that over the last few years, there's been several machineries of government across Victoria and other states as well. I just wonder, I know, and we're in the process, I think, of losing the Victorian Environmental Assessment Council and a few other bodies. I think, a lot of this work is still going to continue, but can I ask, what kind of through lines have you seen in terms of, state and federal support for so many of these initiatives, and where do you think it's kind of headed next, and, on current trends?
Who wants to start us off? Tegan, I can see.
I can tell you what I want, not what I think might be coming. I think it's really around strategic and long-term investment. We're working at ecological scale and timelines here, and at the moment the funding cycles, they don't match when you have to then report on outcomes from ecological benefits. The timelines there are just never going to work. So we really need to restructure the way we can get great outcomes. The National Reserve Fund was incredible, and to meet our 2030 targets nationally and at a state level, I think we really need to start bringing that back up so we can try and meet our 2030 targets of increasing acquisitions and protection. There are also lots of money and uncertainty coming in around the Nature Fund and biodiversity markets, and a lot of unclarity really, where we just don't know what that's going to look like. So I suppose bringing that in and actually making sure in the legislation is biodiversity requirements, because at the moment you can do carbon plantations which are not great outcomes for biodiversity. Making sure you're bringing in things like Sierra standards in restoration works and really tangible, measurable things we can bring in Victoria. I'd really love to see some change in covenants and take the lead from Queensland with special wildlife reserves to bring in income from overseas, especially the US, where there's incredible interest in those. So there's lots of opportunities that we can do with different funding models.
Thanks. I think you're probably sort of hinting at the fact that we're not probably investing or performing in this space of biodiversity as we need to be as a nation. And I think Biodiversity Council has done some analysis to exactly quantify what we need to be spending as a nation and as a state on biodiversity if we don't want to see any more extinctions. We've done that analysis, and it's not infeasible. It's approximately 1% of the budget. We currently spend around 0.06% on biodiversity, and given that it supports so much of our GDP, we think it's a kind of pretty important investment to be making. So yes, it's about investing in the right kind of programs to tackle our invasive species, to protect habitats, to bring people along in the journey, and focus on places where threatened species are really in trouble. And it's also about sort of having programs that sort of can appeal to the general public and bring them along with the journey as well.
Other questions? So, at the very back.
Just to bring it down much more local than your just answer then, about 90% of my garden is native plants, but you mentioned the Frankston spider orchid, so I immediately got out my phone and looked out where I could get seeds for that and help grow some of those, and there's nowhere to get them. Is there a program that helps, I suppose, regular folk contribute to the protection of some of those plant species just within our normal environment? Is there a way that we can add or help protect that biodiversity? Are you aware of any program that supports that?
So I think there's a couple of things here. We have... You're spot on. We probably didn't know how to germinate the Frankston spider orchid. I'm not actually sure exactly of the ecology and the knowledge, but there are so many threatened species that if you go to Bunnings, you won't really see, you're not going to see anything like the 700, local native species that there are in Melbourne. So it's in part about kind of creating demand. Speak to your local nurseries and Bunnings about actually increasing the diversity of plants that they have there. Speak to your MPs about having proper investment in the science behind germination. There's a really fantastic under-resourced group at the Botanic Gardens that really is focusing on trying to work out the science of germinating threatened plants. But there are some really fantastic success stories. I want to end on a negative. I think around Melbourne, there are some incredible things that are happening. There's a Melbourne pollinator corridor started by a piano teacher, a wonderful woman by the name of Emma Cutting, who had this vision of creating, highways for insects through Melbourne, and is just bringing communities on board in a really special way to create gardens in streetscapes, front yards, parks, schoolyards, to really create those corridors for pollinators. And there's some developers who are doing some amazing stuff. We worked with two really interesting developments. One in Cape Patterson, they call it Cape, which is an extraordinary eco-village built on prior kind of degraded agricultural land, but now has 140 bird species and a mob of kangaroos and echidnas, and it was really quite a special place to live. On the other side, we work with the Nightingale developers in Coburg. This is an old factory site, no biodiversity value to start with. It's going to be really high density housing, and it's carbon neutral and really efficient for water. But they've also decided they want to bring back fairy wrens amongst about 20 other species that they're really focusing on. So they're putting nature into every nook and cranny in this development. It's 100% affordable, 10% social housing, and I think if they are demonstrations that we can do better in development in this country.
Thank you. Great story. Yes.
Yeah, everybody else, I'll have another crack. Just before I ask a question, just to add to the point that you made about the discrepancy between funding models and ecology, I'll just share a quick anecdote because I think people might find it interesting. So when we did a lot of work for local councils, the way that the tender and funding cycle would work, we'd quote for jobs to control certain weeds, and then by the time they went through their process of granting, who got the work and all the rest of it, and we actually hit boots on the ground, all of the plants had gone to seed. So we're spending money to try and control weeds when they're producing potentially 1,000 seeds per plant, or a mature serrated tussock 10,000 seeds per plant. So the work that we were doing was incredibly frustrating. So that's an example of things that could be changed, that, you know, the funding cycle better matching the ecology of what we're actually trying to do would make it incredibly more beneficial to tackle that. So my question is partly around that and partly around the developers. Like, you mentioned developers that are doing good work. I've seen a mix of good and bad. Some of my friends that currently work as environmental consultants have expressed frustration around some of the rules around developer offset contributions, where they have to try and protect certain areas of biodiversity, or, you know, revegetate a creek. My understanding is those rules they've been pretty stagnant for a while. So my question is, the things that you guys are looking at, you've said there's good data and you're producing good information. Are you tackling some of those, you know, real niche kind of on the ground issues like funding cycles or developer offset contributions, updating the rules to ensure that, you know, you can get better outcomes without necessarily spending another dollar, just by, you know, shifting the dials a little bit?
We might broaden this question and give both of our speakers an opportunity, you know, to broaden out. Just, if they had a wish list, what would they like from the government? I think this is where you're going. What's your top wish list that you'd like from the government to help in biodiversity?
Oh, okay. You and a thing. A wish list. I mean, I think number one, governments can really ramp up investment in nature, and I think the returns on that will be, you know, really substantial. So it's a really worthy kind of investment. I think looking at protection of what we currently have, you know, I can't sort of say strongly enough that it's, once you've lost biodiversity, it's really hard to build it back. And we've heard multiple stories about that today already. We need to protect everything that we have, because we have so little left. And then I think it's also about having policies to be regenerative for nature. We don't really have many of those across Australia. You know, really asking developers. I work in Adelaide a lot with Green Adelaide, where they've legislated for biodiversity sensitive urban design. So now all developments have to demonstrate how biodiversity is going to be better off when they've finished a development than before they've started the development. And Canberra is going in the same direction. We're working with New South Wales at the moment as well. So I think it's on the cards, and it's a really desirable approach that people love. Developers can work with, they still make a buck, and it generates far healthier environments for people and much better outcomes for biodiversity.
Just thinking about, like, what are we doing in action to be able to kind of tackle some of those really tricky things. So some colleagues of mine in WA have just produced the most biodiverse carbon planting known in Australia, and it is extraordinary in the southwest of WA. So as a not-for-profit agency, we're working on private land. So I really want to be able to show what we can do on private land, the benefits of it. You know, the benefits, Mount Buckra-Bunyul, one of our reserves in this Karakara-Wedderburn landscape, is an extraordinary example. It's a 564-hectare sacred site, which Jarrah have been excluded from since colonisation. They requested us to purchase it because there was no other model for that protection to happen. And now we're working in partnership to get rid of a state nationally registered weed, you know, wheel cactus. It is prickly pear's big mean brother is the best way I can describe it. And it's going to take $10 million to remove it when you look at the scale of the work and the just consistency that you need. You can't take your foot off some of these ecological problems. You have to continue it or you start again. So it's really around maintaining and having that long-term strategy and vision for what we want to achieve, not just those short terms, actually really focusing on, right, we need to get to here. We've set those targets across the world. Now Australia, states have them. So what do we need to do to get there, and not just looking at that, you know, next 3-year government cycle, but looking much further afield and then how we can achieve that. Because I mean, ALCA put out a paper, and you look at $40 million of government investment could probably be leveraged to $80 million through the private land conservation and philanthropy, and making those distinct connections gives us time to scale that up for real-world outcomes.
I think that's a great place to finish our questioning on. So again, I reiterate, what you've really heard is that there's a little economic argument. This is not a nice to have. You've got two people here who are really happy for you to reach out to them. You can reach out to them through the Parliamentary Library to act as a resource to help provide information to you. What are the health benefits? You've heard today the health benefits. This is, as I said, I can't stress enough, this is not a nice to have. How can we help the government help biodiversity? So firstly, just if I have you join me in just thanking our two speakers. And of course, in making these things happen, I'd really like to thank our Parliamentary Library hosts, Carolyn, Deborah, and Annie, for all of their work in setting these up. The next one of these events will be on the 4th of June, so please put that into your diary. And also, I'd like to thank Jan Tennant, who is the liaison from the Academy with the library, for her work. And with that, thank you very much for your attendance today.